It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Matthew Stewart, author of many books and also a writer for The Atlantic magazine, to deliver this year's Laurel Lecture in Philosophy, made possible by a fund established in 1908 by Joseph Laurel, class of 1855. We also have sponsorship from the Faculty Lectureship Series, the Center for the Study of American Democracy, and the program, integrated program in Humane Studies. I would love to give you a very extensive tour of Mr. Stewart's biography. But you can find that on mwstewart.com, which I would refer you to. His About section will tell you a little bit more about his background. But just briefly, he studied at Princeton and Oxford, took a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford, and decided that the academy was not for him, so went into management consulting, wrote a book. I adore the book, but it was not a commercial success, so he went back into management consulting. His first book, The Truth About Everything, is a tongue-in-cheek history of philosophy that manages to be both informative and a call to all of us to engage in philosophy. But after a second tour in the management consulting world, he wrote a book called The Management Myth, which the Wall Street Journal called a devastating bombardment of managerial thinking and the profession of management consulting. His most recent book, Nature's God, about the American founders' idea of the deity and deism in general, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and copies are for sale outside after the talk. Several other books, which I would encourage you to check out, but I will not take up any more of our speaker's time and let him get to it. He will be speaking on aristocracy and its discontents, which is inspired by research that he did and thinking he did for a piece that was a cover story in the June issue of The Atlantic, which many of you may have seen and which made President Obama's reading list for the summer. So I ask you all to join me in welcoming Matthew Stewart.
Thank you, Bob. Am I coming through on this? No. Okay. I'll stand over here. Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here. Really an honor and a privilege to come. I think I should start off with a couple of trigger warnings. One is this presentation has lots of graphs, so if data is a problem for you, be prepared. The other thing is this is really my first extended talk on this particular subject, so please be kind. If it looks like I feel more comfortable talking about American history, that's probably because that's the case. But let me try. I came to this topic of inequality really through two different routes. One is through personal experience. It's a phase of life thing. I realized as I was raising my kids that they were growing up very differently than I had grown up. So there was a personal motivation. But at the same time, my interest is in history. And the other big motivation for me is that as I was working on different aspects of history and writing about history, the parallels with the present moment came to seem more urgent and more important. So what I'm going to do to make this hopefully not too painful for you is to go over a handful of strange, weird, historical-fictional parallels between the past and the present that I hope will illuminate something about the predicament we're in with respect to inequality. And then I'll go into some grand generalizations about the sources of America's increasing class stratification. The what is to be done, which I think was in the subtitle before, I'm going to mainly punt on that and ask for your contributions. So I thought I'd start with a shout out to any classics majors here in ancient Greece. You may remember that, of course, Achilles was understood to be the swiftest and the strongest of the ancient Greek or ancient Mycenaean warriors, and his mother adored him. Here she says, like some fair plant beneath my careful hand, he grew, he flourished, and he graced the land. And that's a vase that I pulled off the internet where the young Tyro is finishing off Penthesilea. She's the queen of the Amazons. who may have been his true love, but that's a separate story. So the interesting thing for me is that it turns out that there's proof to some degree. If you, paleoanthropologists have gone through the graveyards of ancient Mycenae, and they discover that, in fact, the kings were substantially taller than the commoners. And they weren't just taller, but they had better bones. They had thicker, rounder fibulas and femurs, and the pelvic bones were more arched, and the skull base heights are higher, and the teeth score 5 times better on a index of dental health. And it turns out that this pattern of differentials among the classes is pretty common throughout history after the agricultural revolution. So this graph shows average height of males in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Stone Age, essentially, and then in the periods after that up through the 19th century. And I think what it allows you to conclude is, first, it does seem that the agricultural revolution shrank the human race to some degree, but it didn't shrink the kings and queens and the aristocrats. It tended to shrink the common man. So you could say that inequality shrank the human race to some degree. And what strikes me when you look at the relics of these cultures, like when you read Homer, is the relative blindness that they have to this kind of cruelty that was endemic in their culture. I mean, as far as moms like Thetis were concerned, it was just a fact of nature, a beautiful, blossoming thing that her son Achilles was the bravest and the swiftest. But behind it, there was a much more cruel dynamic. And I guess my theme question for today and the subject of this talk is, are we really so different? So this reflects what seems to be a growing divide in the United States now in health outcomes. It turns out that if you are a college graduate over the past 25 years, your mortality rate has been going down. That's the red line in the graph on the left. But if you have a high school or less education, your chances of dying have actually gone up over the past 25 years. And this is quite dramatic, and it's a new and disturbing development in the United States. It also turns out that there's a very strong correlation between income and incidence of disease, and also bad teeth. So at the very same time that we have this change in health, and we have two very different, we have clearly social status driving health to some degree. We have, curiously, and I offer this by juxtaposition merely, a tendency to make a religion out of fitness. So for $30 or $40 an hour, you can find your soul in a room full of people riding bikes, sweating, with candles burning. Or I found this in Santa Monica. You can go have somebody stretch your body for $90 an hour or $120 if it's in Manhattan. I'm not trying to be judgy here. I just want to draw attention to the fact that this religion of fitness, it takes as a fundamental premise the idea that your health is a matter of your own internal choice. It's a purely spiritual thing. I think that's terrific for motivation, but I wonder if it takes us away from the basic fact that in the United States today is actually your social status that determines your health to a significant degree. So that's my first historical story. My second one, and I apologize to any English professors here because I'm going to offer an incredibly reductive reading here of a pretty well-known text. But you'll remember that Mr. Darcy is the male lead in Pride and Prejudice. And you might remember this early scene where he's at a dance and he's not dancing, and Elizabeth Bennet is not dancing because none of the men want to dance with her, and someone suggests to him that he should go dance with Elizabeth Bennet, and he says, well, she's tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I'm in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. All right, so basically he's a jerk, right? And so what is the attraction? And now I'm going to offer my punishable interpretation. It's really pretty straightforward at a certain level, right? I mean, he's on 10,000 pounds a year. Now, what's 10,000 pounds worth in 1815 or so? Scullery maids made 2 to 5 pounds a year. Housekeepers made 20 pounds a year. GDP per capita is estimated around 20 pounds per year. So essentially, he could keep a village of 500 people afloat with that income. But the question is, where are those people? Because they don't show up in Jane Austen's book, or at least maybe a few of them might show up here and there, but nothing like 500 show up. They're kind of invisible. Now, I don't mean to suggest that that Elizabeth Bennet or Mr. Darcy, that they're just gold diggers. I think they're after true love, but in a way that makes it more disturbing, because they're out there, the more efficiently they seek true love, the more efficiently they reproduce the class system. And at the same time, what I find quite interesting is that Jane Austen is writing at the time of the invention of this great art form of the 19th century, the novel. But the novel is not read by people like it's read by Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, but it's read by many more people than them. It's read by a wider audience. It's essentially people who are not living in wealth themselves, but who are living in the imagination of wealth. And it's that makes me want to ask, are we so different? So here are some of the statistics that turn up if you look at mating patterns in the United States. Over the past 40 years, there's been a significant change in the premium for marrying your like. The technical term is assortative mating. So when two postgrads marry each other, 40 years ago, that produced a certain bang for the buck. Now it's about, relative to two high school graduates marrying each other, it's perhaps 2.5, 3 times higher. And the consequence of that shows up on this graph on the right, where you can see that the chances, the odds of people marrying within their educational category have gone up at a steady clip. And this seems to me to reflect some fundamental shift that's driven by something pretty close to what was going on in Pride and Prejudice. And the consequence of this, and this is basic sort of newspaper level sociology, but it's clear that we're developing two different family structures. So these graphs show the age of mother at first birth in the United States. And in 1980, you can see that there is a even distribution centered at the sort of 19 or 20-year-old mark. But by 2016, we actually have a society that's broken up into 2 separate humps. We've got a 2-hump society. There's one group of mothers who are giving birth at around age 19 or 20, and then there's another group that are doing it 10 years later, and in between, there's actually a dip. So we're separating on that axis, but in fact, if you probe deeper into the information we have on these groups of people, what you find is that these families are different in many other respects as well. That this second hump is going to include people who are, on average, much more educated, have higher income, much more likely to be in a 2-parent household, much more likely to invest in their children. And the consequence of that, of course, is that their children are much more likely to enter into that second hump. So I came to this, we all have experiences along these lines. I don't think mine is necessarily privileged, but I did want to share how I've interacted with this experience. And these two things sort of come from my own background. Raising Brooklyn is a sociological text. But for me, it reminds me a lot of parenting in New York. When I would take my first child to the playground, that book on the left shows pretty much what I would see. You see the regulation McLaren stroller, you see the most usually white tot, and then you see a Caribbean nanny. And there's a nice touch. I don't know if you can see it. There's a license plate. I can't point to it, but there's a license plate on the stroller. So if people going by can kind of police the nanny and call in if she's misbehaving. I think that picture actually says quite a lot about it says a lot about the cost of extreme parenting. It says a lot about social and racial divisions in New York. To some degree, it also says something about the relatively low value that our society places on child care. So it's interesting. On the other hand, if you turn on the TV, you might see something more like Jessie, and this is a show that I only know because my kids were watching it until I confiscated their devices. And it's a show about a nanny in New York, and she's a redhead, and the kids are an ethnically diverse group because they've been adopted, but they live in a penthouse because everybody does, and they have a butler who's the butt of a bunch of weight jokes. And the dad is a really rich guy who's never home, kind of a jerk, like maybe a Mr. Darcy, and they have a Komodo dragon, because again, every family does, right? So my point is just that we are evolving this distinct family structure, but it shows up in our culture in a very different way from the reality. We've got what one critic calls 1% TV, which shows us a reality that's pretty different from what's actually on the ground. My third historical connection with the past. I've always been a Don Quixote fan, and I think of him as the downwardly mobile scholar. So here's another really reductive reading of a piece of great literature. What you need to know in the backstory is Spain, of course, was incredibly wealthy in the 16th and 17th centuries, but that was on the basis of gold that was pillaged from the New World. In the long term, it was actually deadly for the Spanish economy because it undermined their productivity. But more than that, it resulted in a significant concentration of wealth. So the king and his cronies became incredibly powerful and wealthy, and then a bunch of lesser nobles, the hidalgos, were kind of shunted off to the side. And of course, Don Quixote was one of those lesser hidalgos, kind of running out of money and running out of reasons. I know that some of the sociologists use him to describe what they call a Don Quixote effect, which is essentially a version of living in the past, when you have certain assumptions about what matters in life and what's important, but the world has sort of moved on without you. It tends to happen in places where there's a lot of downward mobility, and sure enough, there is downward mobility in the United States. These are significant and I think also alarming statistics about life in the United States now. The graph on the left shows the percentage of children who earn more than their parents in absolute real terms. And in the 1940s or so, that number would have been around 90%. And it's now, for recent cohorts, around 50%. So half of people now are not doing better than their parents. The graph on the right is an attempt to do something similar with the status of occupation. So a sociologist has ranked professions by status and asked whether children exceed their parents in status. And there again, you can see the downward slope in the lines. But I want to focus on the question of education, which of course is very dear to someone like Don Quixote. We all know that there's a premium for attending college in the United States, and that premium has been going up. That is the value of college relative to not going to college. And I think the story we tell ourselves is that this reflects a kind of skills gap, that we're getting something in college that the non-college goers don't have. But when you examine the data a little more closely, what you see is that in fact there's this rising premium masks a growing gap among the graduates, that you have graduates mainly from different schools performing very, very differently in the economy. So if you go to one of the, I call them top $10 U's, that is the universities that generate the highest return, according to one study, you earn a 20-year net ROI. I wouldn't take these numbers too seriously, but it's some substantial amount. Let's say $1 million is what that one study came up with. Whereas if you go to what I call Don QU, you actually experience a net loss once you factored in the cost of college. And the result of that is that we have a growing population of downwardly mobile people. That is, people who formally have education but are downwardly mobile. And you can see them in a lot of places. If you ride an Uber, you can come across them. But I thought it's interesting that you can also find a fair number in modern universities. So this is just one of many stories that you can find. This is a woman named Mary Faith Sarasoli. And I guess what drew me to her story is that she's an adjunct professor, as are about 50% of faculty at the universities across the United States now. And she teaches Romance languages, so I imagine she's probably teaching Cervantes, but it turns out that she is homeless. So I think that the question I want to, that motivated me is, why do we have this population appearing amongst us now? Here's my fourth story. This one goes more into the field of American history. So 1785, Thomas Jefferson, he's ambassador to France, and he's wandering around Fontainebleau, which is the sort of playground of the French king and the court. There are vast tracts of land set aside for aristocratic hunting parties and huge palaces. But at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of poverty. So Jefferson is walking through the woods, and he starts walking along with a poor woman, a day laborer. And she tells him about her miserable conditions, and that she basically has to work from day to day. Sometimes she doesn't have enough food to eat. She can't feed her 2 children, and so on. And at the end of the walk, Jefferson reaches in his pocket, and he gives her 24 sous, which is literally pocket change for him. And she bursts into tears of gratitude. So what does Jefferson do? He goes home, and he writes a letter to his friend James Madison. And he says, Jim, I'm paraphrasing, this concentration of wealth is bad news. It's very bad news. It brings misery to the bulk of humankind, causes massive instability. And by the way, he was writing this in 1785. 4 years later, there was a revolution in France, so I think it was a pretty good analysis. And then he says, so Jim, we need to do something about this. We have to avoid this in the United States. And he proposes what he calls a geometric tax on property. We would call that a progressive wealth tax. And he proposes reforms to inheritance law because he's clear he really wants to avoid this concentration of wealth. And then he justifies it with what I find to be a fascinating, I mean, this is the kind of thing I get excited about, the political philosophy. He justifies it with what I think is a really important line. He says, whenever there is in any country uncultivated lands and unemployed poor, it is clear that the laws of property have been so far extended as to violate natural right. The earth is given as a common stock for man to labor and live on. And I don't want to go have a big digression on political theory here, but I just want to point out that a lot of ideology today is based on the mistaken idea that natural right and the laws of property are essentially identical. And here he makes a very clear distinction between those two. And the other thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that he says that the earth is common stock for man to labor and live on, which sounds, frankly, socialist or something like that, which is what I thought when Thomas Piketty's book came out. So when I don't know if you remember when this Piketty's book came out about 4 years ago, a significant part of the reaction, well, let me step back. I think you all know Piketty argues that the concentration of wealth is essentially the defining problem of our age, and that it has been growing, and he argues that it's due to sort of fundamental forces of economics. But he also argues for a progressive wealth tax, pretty much what Jefferson was arguing for. He also argues for reform of inheritance law, again, very much in line with Jefferson's thinking, at least in Fontainebleau. But the response I found was quite amusing, because a significant part of the criticism was along the lines of this is Marxist propaganda, it's a communist manifesto for the 20th century, or my favorite, call it Capital II, the Wrath of Karl. So my point here is not to digress on America's founders and offer a particular interpretation. I take for granted there's going to be a range of interpretations, but I want to draw your attention to the question of where the center point of a debate lies. And what strikes me is that the center point of at least our public debates about America's founders and America's heritage lie very far from where the evidence should, I think, reasonably take it. And this is, I think, something that we can see in other fields of intellectual endeavor. There is a kind of tilting of the intellectual field that I think is quite remarkable and that we should pay attention to. So for my last historical parallel, I want to draw attention to the man who first said that the idea of America is that of a democracy, which is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And spoiler alert for anybody who wants to show up tomorrow, that's not Abraham Lincoln. It's actually a guy named Theodore Parker, who was the first to really promote that message. So I'll talk a bit about Parker tomorrow to anybody who wants to hear about that. But just very briefly, he was an abolitionist. He was a heretic, and he was quite militant. He ended up being one of the funders of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So Parker thought that slavery was not just a moral evil, but he certainly thought that, but he also thought it was a political and economic evil, that it was impoverishing the entire country, that it was making the United States unstable. And the question that he was asking himself is, why did the nation go along with such a destructive policy? And his basic answer is here. And for me, this was a very important passage in helping me relate the past to the present. And here the message is really very simple, but I'll just read it out. He says, 300,000 proprietors own 1,300 millions of money invested in men. In virtue thereof, they control the legislation of their own states. They keep the poor white man from political power, from comfort. They destroy his self-respect and leave him nothing but his body. From the poorest of the poor, they take away his body itself. Next, they control the legislation of America. They make the president. They appoint the Supreme Court. They control the Senate, the representatives. They determine the domestic and foreign policy of the nation. The consolidated property of 1/80th part of the population controls all the rest. So he's basically arguing that the top 1.25% controls the country, and that is what is driving the nation towards civil war. He was saying this in the early 1850s. He died in 1860, but in his writings, he pretty much forecasts every significant event that would happen over the next 5 years. If you go into more detail and try to understand the kind of analysis that he's making, here's his developed answer to how the top 1.25% controlled things. They basically gerrymandered, in a certain sense, the electoral system, which allowed them to have disproportionate representation in the federal government as well as in their own states. They controlled a lot of the national discourse. You could say that they had something like a propaganda network. They had tremendous control of the nation's churches. So although we like to tell ourselves lots of stories about nice abolitionists wanting to free the slaves out of religious motivation, in fact, overwhelmingly the churches were supporting the project of this top 1.25%. And of course, quite obviously, they made use of racism. And they didn't simply use racism, but they promoted it actively and encouraged it and developed it because it sustained their power. So that was Theodore Parker's analysis in the 1850s. And to me, it struck me as familiar. I mean, you can draw your own conclusions, but I thought that was, something that might shed light on what we see going on in the United States now. So those were my 5 little bits of history that drew me to this topic. They're things I've been working on for a while. And now I'll offer very briefly, because I want to leave time for people to interrupt me, I'll go through very briefly some of what I think are the deep structures that at work. Now, this graph, you're all familiar with some version of this graph, unless you've been living under a rock. It's launched 1,000 essays. And this shows just the share of the national income claimed by the top 1%, and it's gone up quite dramatically over the last 40 years. For me, graphs have limited utility. They're just numbers, and they don't really represent the complexity of social reality, but I want to offer a slightly better graph. Why is this better? First, I think we should be talking about distribution of wealth before we talk about distribution of income, because wealth is what confers power and advantage. A second point is that the concentration of wealth in the United States has happened mainly in the top 0.1%. So that's the red line at the bottom. And it's that rising red line at the bottom that we've been, that perhaps a lot of the discussion is focused on. A third important point is that the people who lost share were not, in fact, everybody else, the 99.9%, but in fact, it was the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution that lost money. And that's what you see with the blue line there. The blue line rises through the middle years of the 20th century. Essentially, the middle class is growing in strength. And then starting around 1980, early 1980s, it starts falling to the point where it's now at the same level as the top 0.1%, which means that essentially 900 people have together the wealth of one person in the top 0.1%. But that leaves this group in between, the 9.9%. and they are represented by the gray line here. And what you can see is that they actually hold pretty steady over time. And the important thing there is that if you think that most people are basically in that blue line, it's not really all that reasonable to aspire to be a member of the 0.1%. You can do it, but you're a little bit idiotic if you make that your life's goal. But aspiring to be part of the 9.9% is the way in which you can define a reasonable form of the American dream. But if you could look at the ratio between the blue line and the gray line, what's happened over the last 40 years is that leap that you have to make to get into the 9.9% has gone up dramatically. In fact, it's more than doubled. And I want to focus on that 9.9%, or I have focused on that 9%, not because I think that that one class in society is responsible for all of our ills, or that they're the ones who need to be sent off to the, with the kulaks or something like that, but rather because to the extent that we have a social class problem, it's basically going to be in that group and in its relations with the rest of society. And I want to add one more piece to the numbers, but I think it's really important in figuring out how the American class system is evolving. This graph shows the racial composition in very big categories, just black, Latino, and everybody else, mostly white, of the bottom 90% and of the top 9.9%, or of the 9.9%. And so what you can see is that black and Latinos represent over 30%, roughly a third of the bottom 90%, but only about 4% of the top 9.9%. So, in rough statistical terms, it's about as, in purely statistical terms, it's about as hard for a black or Latino person to enter the 9.9% as it is for a white person to make it to the top 1 or 1.2%. And I bring that up not just because it seems obvious to me that this is a residue of a tremendous amount of racism and discrimination. I want to make actually a more ambitious and maybe more unsettling point, which is that this kind of pattern isn't something that is just a legacy of history. This has to be fairly constantly reproduced. It takes effort, and I'm going to suggest that, in fact, inequality is this kind of dynamic not only promotes inequality, but is promoted by it, so that we will very likely see, if anything, more racism with inequality. And then there's a more general point that I wanted to make about inequality and how we talk about it. And this is a very a sweeping generalization, but I do feel that over the past 10 years there's been the inequality discussion has kind of moved along lines that have been laid out by the climate discussion, in that an initial response is, well, there is no inequality. And in fact, there was a fair amount of that. And certainly in response to Piketty's book, there was quite a bit of that. He thought the data is all bad, it's not really happening. That usually went away, but then it's followed by an inequality doesn't matter kind of argument, right? That, so what if somebody has a power boat and somebody else doesn't? As long as everybody has a refrigerator or an air conditioner, everything is great. But that, I think, also becomes quite hard to sustain when you see the secondary and tertiary consequences of inequality. That then leads to a third level where you say something like, well, inequality, yeah, maybe it matters, but it's not really caused by humans. It's caused by vast global forces that are pretty much beyond our control. And usually the buzzwords are things like technology and globalization. And I want to take aim at that. But then there's a fourth level that I also want to take aim at, which is something like, okay, inequality is caused by other humans, but it's not caused by me. So it's other people, right? And that, I guess, was the theme that was coming through to me from the historical examples, and that was what I wanted to get out in the piece I wrote for the Atlantic. So I called this group the 9.9%, but I also offered the term the 5 Gs, meaning that it's a group of people defined by not just a certain amount of wealth, but access to good schools, good neighborhoods, good health, good family, and good jobs. And I offered this kind of goofy chart here to sort of represent, in a very simplistic way, what I think is going on. At the center of our inequality issue I think there is some form of wealth extraction. That is, there's a fair amount of rent seeking that goes on in the economy. There's ample evidence that there is significant monopolistic, oligopolistic, or other rent-seeking operations. There are intellectual property laws that tend to favor rent-seeking. And at the same time, there has been a consistent war on labor. I mean, our union membership has gone down dramatically. Workers have had consistently less power at the bargaining table than in the past. And the result of that is essentially a kind of fountain of wealth. And what's happened is that a class has emerged around it, not necessarily taking that money directly. That, in a way, the extractive wealth is what goes to the 0.1%. But what the 5Gs successfully do is something that human beings have done successfully throughout history, which is where they find the fountain of wealth, they build a perimeter around it, and they protect it so they can keep it and keep others out. And since we've already discussed some of these mechanisms, I think they're pretty straightforward. We have good schools. I mean, of course, in theory, universities have been the engines of mobility in the United States. But to a significant degree, they've turned into engines of reproducing class divisions. Our neighborhoods, we concentrate our wealth there. We have some of the best schools in our good neighborhoods. Those good neighborhoods also have better commutes. They also have better social networks. They offer much more opportunity. So what do we do with those neighborhoods? Well, we set up exclusionary zoning policies that drive up the prices in those neighborhoods and keep other people out. So that's a way in which we essentially set up a barrier for people coming in. Good health, again, operates in a very subtle way. Nobody is actively trying to impose bad health on people, and yet, in fact, health and healthcare serves as a form of class warfare in the United States. And good family, it turns out to be pretty much the same thing. And then you have, of course, the Don Quixotes and the distinction between good jobs and bad jobs. And there's increasing evidence that it's not a matter of the category of job, but rather having a job that links you to, for example, a superstar firm that is connected with the blue circle at the middle. So I apologize that it's admittedly simplistic and reductive, but I'm using this to try to draw attention to what I think is a really important dynamic that's going on in modern American society. And here is the proof that to some degree it's working. This is a measure of social mobility in different countries. The measure here is intergenerational earnings elasticity. So it basically tells you how much of the child's income is predicted by the parent's income. And it turns out that in the land of opportunity, the United States, we actually have essentially a higher degree of immobility. That is to say, in the United States, once you've chosen your parents, the game is about half over, right? So we compare quite unfavorably with countries like Canada, which is on this measure twice as mobile, and the Nordic countries. And all of that, I think, can be summarized in this process, which I found quite fascinating and really formed the kind of backbone of my thinking and led me to think that this is a very serious issue. This rise in immobility, it turns out, is connected with the rise in inequality. And while this is merely a correlation, this shows on the x-axis the income inequality, and on the y-axis the the intergenerational earnings elasticity. It's just a correlation, but there's every reason to think that there is, in fact, a pretty straightforward mechanism here. The more the haves have, the easier they find it to protect what they have. And this is what's been happening in our society, and it's what happens around the world. And this is perhaps the most important thing. It happens throughout history. Here's a second fundamental point that's not quite in this graph, but I think follows from this basic logic. This kind of mechanism, where you get higher inequality leading to higher immobility, is bad for an economy. It impoverishes. This was the point that Theodore Parker was making. So slavery is, of course, morally bad, but in fact, the farther you go down that road, the more you impoverish everybody. So what I'm describing is a process that is almost, you might think, too dire, right? Because how can we, I mean, if it's this bad, then why would we have had any economic growth? So I want to kind of draw to a close by drawing your attention to the big picture in human history. And this is, very big, wildly speculative. But I do want to point out, it's a really simple fact about human history, that the world, human history can fall into two very simple chapters. One of them is incredibly long. It runs for 8,000 or 10,000 years after the agricultural revolution, and presumably some tens or hundreds of thousands of years before that. And then there's this other chapter, which is only about 2 centuries long. I mean, our experience of a wildly productive world is incredibly brief. We spend a lot of time, and I have 2 graphs here because the one on the left shows GDP, which is arguably a kind of strange concept to apply to pre-modern economies. And this is another attempt by an economist to come up with a development index, but it shows roughly the same picture, that the world was just dramatically different 200 years ago. And we spent a lot of time writing history books about the inflection point. I've written one, why did the world change? And so we obsess about what happened around 1800. And that's all well and good, but there's another question we should be asking ourselves, which is, what on earth went on for 8,000 or 10,000 years of human history? I mean, why was it so stagnant? I mean, if it only takes 2 centuries to break out, then why didn't it happen 1,000 years ago? Why didn't China do it? Why didn't it happen during the Roman Empire? Or why weren't the Assyrians able to do it? And I want to suggest that this question about inequality is, in fact, one of the fundamental reasons for that essentially human beings spent 8,000 or 10,000 years figuring out how to exploit one another, and that necessarily put a huge damper on any possibility of breaking out. I want to go even farther with wild philosophical speculation and suggest that to some degree indicts the human capacity for reason. That is to say that assuming that it's generally better to live in a world that has these material benefits that we have, that has the relative degrees of freedom and well-being that we have, it's pretty astonishing that we went through this great stagnation, and that should make us question our rationality. And so the guiding idea that I want to use in thinking about these inequality problems, and I'm just going to state it as a doctrine because I won't be able to defend it unless you brought your sleeping bags, it's that equality and rationality are coextensive, by which I mean to suggest that inequality necessarily breeds a kind of irrationality in human society, a kind of self-destructiveness, and that the key thing that happened in producing the modern world was a certain recognition, very partial and incomplete, of equality that then in turn led to a greater degree of rationality. So that's my grand analysis. I said on what is to be done. I can't give you a whole policy program here. My basic thinking is just let's talk about root causes. I think often the inequality discussion leads to calls for redistribution. I think some redistribution of income, of course, makes sense, but I'm more interested in redistribution of power, basically taking power away from monopolistic systems, empowering labor, ending welfare for the wealthy through our various forms of subsidization of existing power structures. And there are other, I think, really important and obvious policy ideas, but none of this is terribly original with me. I'll just draw attention to one thing about it. I do think it's important to think of all of our issues as connected to this issue. So yes, of course, there's a lot to talk about in climate, but I don't think you should be talking about climate without also bringing inequality into it. Our technology is going to advance. Artificial intelligence is going to be certainly an important issue. But again, its impact on inequality and inequality's impact on it, I think, has to be central to any discussion of that. And so lastly, though, as I say, this is kind of easy in a sense because I can just come up with any number of menu of options. I want to suggest, and the main thing I want to communicate is just my sense that that if we're going to tackle this problem, it does require a certain amount of rethinking of who we are, where our values lie in life. To some degree, this kind of inequality that we're seeing, it reproduces itself in our own minds, in the ways in which we choose what is important to value, and it shows up in where we choose to live and how we choose to live. And I don't have any easy answer for that, but I do want to suggest that we do have some resources to draw on. That that we can draw in philosophy, because at least as I understand it, philosophy should be about stripping away illusions. It should be about clearing away our misunderstandings, and I think we could use some of that. And by the way, this comes from the cover of one of my books. This is my favorite cover. That's my friend Friedrich Nietzsche up there. Anyway, thank you for putting up with my first inequality talk. Are there questions that anyone would like to raise? I hope I haven't stunned you into silence. Yes.
If I remember correctly, in your Atlantic article this summer, you talked about how rather than addressing inequality, we're sometimes bringing the best and the brightest from the bottom 90% up into the top 9.9%, so that part of the reproduction you talk about is that even we need institutions to expand the elite, but we don't undo the inequality.
Yeah, I think that there's a serious issue with elite institutions imagining that they're solving the problem by allowing in a small stream of people from around. But if in fact the power is still concentrated, that only addresses one set of concerns, but it doesn't in fact change the basic structure. I think we actually overestimate mobility too, by the way, in the sense that 17th century England had mobility, because if what actually happened with Charles I was he fell in love with a harlot, as they called it, and she moved up to the royal bedchamber. So that's mobility, right? But it didn't actually change the power structure. So that's, I think, the issue that I want to get at there. You have a question?
Yeah, I wonder if there's some of the data you showed suggests that in the U.S. the mid-20th century is really an anomaly. Right? So there's a period of closing the gap of inequality. There's a period of what appears to be more social mobility that may be a function of the fact that the Depression was so bad that immediately after the Depression everyone was doing better than their parents, but then it sort of returned back to the mean. I guess I wonder, what are your thoughts if you look at a window that stretches into the 19th century, and certainly your references to the 1850s kind of suggest that. Is it really the case that we are in that a period of closing the gap of inequality in the U.S. is an anomaly of like 25 to 30 years of the mid-20th century, and for the most part, it's a depressing high level of inequality is really the definition of
Right. No, those are great questions, really great points. And really there's two there that I want to try to answer. First on the middle years of the 20th century, and then on the previous time periods. The middle years of the 20th century were anomalous, and there are various explanations, but to me the most credible ones simply point out that there was a Great Depression that kicked back capital values tremendously, and more important than that, there was a war, which is not a great thing, but it turns out that war is a great leveler. And by the way, the mechanisms of leveling are some of them are obvious, you destroy lots of stuff, but another is war empowered women. So that actually had and it also empowered labor. So that had a very significant effect, and that carried the United States through a period of an expanding middle class. There was also, by the way, in response to the Depression, a kind of rational response by the government in promoting forms of socialism. That is, there were suddenly government retirement plans, government education plans, the GI Bill and stuff like that. Now, of course, we know socialism for white people, so it was kind of limited, but it did actually improve the situation for at least significant parts of the middle class. So that's a very important part of American history, but it now looks in retrospect as if it was an anomaly. If you go back to earlier periods, I would say there are two other periods where you might have some kind of leveling. One is in the early, the colonial period around the time of the American Revolution, there was some leveling. And you have to remember that the colonists are part of a global world, and they're still part of England to some degree, and they saw themselves as being much more level than the English, and they were. In fact, the evidence is pretty compelling. The richest people in England were 10 or 20 times richer than the richest people in America. So I think that you could make a case that there was some leveling there, and that actually shows up in certain parts of the American Revolution, parts that we often don't talk as much about as we should. In my book, the guy named Thomas Young, who was a representative of this kind of egalitarian American Revolution. We should talk about that. The other period that's worth pointing out, but it was sadly brief, of course, is the immediate post-Civil War period. And again, war being the key agent there. War causing some leveling, and of course, after Reconstruction ended, that was swiftly reversed, and the white planter elite reclaimed its power. More questions over here? Yeah, yes. Yeah.
On your last slide, one of your points in order to redistribute this breakup space of influence was to get money out of politics, media, etc. But the people who are going to be the most influential within this are the people who end up in that 9.9% who are now benefiting from the census. How can we realistically make these changes if the bottom 90% who need them aren't able to politically mobilize due to work hours, income, et cetera?
So you're saying it's because the bottom 90% can't put money in politics, we can't reform it, we can't, yeah.
Can't necessarily.
But you're in favor of doing it, though. You're in favor of getting the money out of politics, right? Because, I mean, I'm in favor of that, too, and I'm not sure I've thought through the mechanism for actually implementing it. Because, I mean, because as I said, it's easy for me. I'm just, what I'm going to mandate right now is public funding of campaigns. Okay, that's my position. How we can achieve that if only the 9.9% are funding it? Well, here's my other point. The reason why I write articles like this that are aimed at 9.9%ers, and by the way, that's a lot of you here, is because I think that you will actually work for this. I think that many of you will see this as a valuable long-term plan for the United States, and you'll see beyond the narrow self-interest that says, oh, I'm wealthy, I live in a good neighborhood, so I want to screw everybody else, right? So, but we should work on the details of the political programming. Yes.
So an interest of mine is the way in which communication occurs between these different social classes, between the top 9.9 and the bottom 90%. In your Atlantic article, you talk about how Americans have this listening problem. You say, oh, that's a problem, part of that problem. How do you think that communication can possibly occur? As someone that is definitely probably 9.9% that grew up surrounded by people who weren't in a rural community, coming to a place like Kenyon, where a lot of coastal elites, a lot of people from these 9.9% areas, I find it hard to even explain my experiences to them, and even vice versa, their experiences to me. So there's a communication problem that's part of this, that I think is part of the solution. Do you have any suggestions on how?
Yeah, no, that's great, and I do think that that's something that we just have to work on so much. I think to have that kind of communication, obviously you need a certain ground of respect, and that's something that in our culture we increasingly lack. The farther apart we get, the less we have even the minimal level of respect that allows us to communicate. And then the other point I would make is that a certain amount of honesty will go a long way. And I'll offer just like my only data point just for your use is that this piece I wrote for The Atlantic, it got a lot of traction, and it got a lot of traction, to my surprise, with people who self-identified as members of the bottom 90%. And that surprised me because, of course, I thought I was more addressing an upper middle class crowd. But a lot of those people basically wrote to say that they thought they see the same patterns, and I think what they were saying is that they just thought that I was calling it like it is and being relatively honest about what's going on in our society. So I do think that a basic honesty is important. But again, that's a good question that would require a long time to think about, I think, to answer properly. Yes, sir.
Not quite sure how to say this, but history does say if you like the French, you mentioned something about the French. When Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," they did. They ate her cake. And is there a certain point where it becomes, the inequality is so much that it is solved through brute force there's a lot of people, and if they feel they're not being taken care of, or there's no chance, and that's a lot of resentment and anger. That's through the and and they have the means just by the sheer numbers to move that needle.
I think that is the basic story of human history, that, groups try to make a living by exploiting other groups, and at some point they provoke a reaction. So I accept that, and I think that is central to what we have to think about. But I do want to add this other qualification. We shouldn't imagine that represents some kind of beautiful self-correcting process.
No, I'm not. It's very
right. It's revolutions. Revolutions are basically bad. Revolutions are turmoil, and they destroy things. And not only that, but resentment in general is a pretty bad emotion to work with. Right.
See that as what is happening at this point a bit.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that, and it's complex. I think it's way too simple to say, economic anxiety resulting from inequality, just produces resentment that then leads to people to want to topple the system. I think the causality is really complex, but at the end of the day, there's some version of that. We're producing a tremendous amount of resentment in our society. And here's, though, where this qualification comes in. I don't think we should imagine that resentment should just be allowed to kind of express itself and then we'll get a much better society. In fact, what will happen is kind of what we're seeing now. That resentment is incredibly easy to manipulate. And in fact, the more it's out there, the easier it is to manipulate. And that, I think, is the basic story of human history, that human societies have always been incredibly unstable, relatively speaking. We live in a remarkably stable period, even with the bad stuff that seems to be happening now. And the reason why they're unstable is they're constantly building up this store of resentment that is then manipulated to make things even worse. So, it's kind of gloomy. But
Jefferson tried to design, and his cohorts tried to design a government that, I think he said, he was one that said, or one of the founding fathers said, a good revolution every 200 years is probably necessary. Now, how you do
refresh
that,
the tree of liberty with blood. James Madison wrote back, or kind of put that letter and stuffed in the desk drawer, said, no, we don't want to do that here. This Constitution should last a bit longer than that. I think that they understood, and I think people like Jefferson also understood that every successful, rational form of democratic government is to some degree a forestalled revolution, or it is a continuing but quiet revolution that readjusts human society to its deepest foundations, to the natural equality that's always very hard to sustain with, amongst a group of rapacious individuals. Yes, over here in the white shirt.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the question about communication, right? And back to your answer to that question. Specifically, you talked about sort of the reaction you got from people who are in the 90%. And I guess my sort of immediate sort of response to that was, right, like, so how many of those people were actually in the 90%, and how many of those people just thought they were in the 90%, and really they were in the 9.9%? Right? Because there's this larger problem going on here where everybody thinks they're in the middle class, right? And if you sort of do surveys of Americans, right, everybody really thinks they're in the middle class, and basically no one wants to recognize that they're in the upper class. And that seems like a problem that sort of underlies the communication problem, and underlies sort of all of the progress, or maybe undermines all the progress we think we might be making in sort of talking about this, right? That people don't recognize their own position within that conversation. So how do we start to address that? How do you push honesty around that, right? Like, is it just that we all need to be really aware of the actual sort of financial cutoffs for different classes, and we need to publish those widely, and then be aware of our own income? Like, how does that work?
That's a really great point. You're absolutely right that we are in denial about our class structure, and that's kind of deadly, right? When people are pretending to be middle class. So we should have some way of calling people out to remind them that they in fact are in positions of relative advantage. I'm reluctant to use just money because that. Someone who graduates from Stanford Business School with a bit of debt technically has negative net worth, right? But they're one of us. And conversely, you may have retirees they've got some money in their house and an IRA, but so they might just get into the group on financial terms, but they don't really count. So it has to be a little more nuanced than just money. but yeah, we need to. I think we need to have a lot more honest conversation about class in America than we do. And I wish I had a better way of explaining that. As far as the people getting back to me, I mean, there definitely are some who clearly are not just self-identifying as 90%. They, by any reasonable criteria, that's what they are. I mean, they tell me where they work. A guy who was writing to me from Arkansas who collects lumber in his pickup truck and drives around and tells me how much he makes out of that is definitely 90%. But at the same time, is quite interested in the analysis. So, and I should also say that I think this, you probably take this for granted, but I got a lot of hate too from people in the 90% as well as the 9.9%. It wasn't all love. Yes, in the back there.
So do you view this inequality as stemming from sort of policy decisions or inherent economic, or the market? Because you talk about how the leveling, sort of, the great equality, was produced because of economic conditions such as the Second World War and the Great Depression. So isn't it possible that the unwinding is also because of, how the market is now playing out in the 21st century versus the past, and that the policy decisions that have been made are sort of just a byproduct that has exacerbated the problem?
Well, remember that you can have kind of policy by omission, right? So if you fail to address a problem that's happening, that in a sense is a certain kind of policy making. Remember also that war in general and that kind of disruption is not a conscious policy that people pursue to reduce inequality. The inequality is just an unintended byproduct of that. But to answer your question, I buy to some extent, to a very partial extent, the argument that Piketty makes that there's a certain structural tendency of economies to concentrate wealth. But I only buy it to a very limited extent because I see lots of policies that at the very least have exacerbated this trend, and I think arguably account for perhaps most of it. I mentioned the policies on labor. Those are optional, and different countries pursue different policies with respect to labor, and the outcome is visible in the different country statistics. Countries that have relatively high degree of labor power tend to have lower inequality measures. So those are conscious policy choices. I think that the antitrust policy is also a conscious policy choice. And again, the United States is a real laggard on this. We're not the ones who are fining Google, it's the European Union. And by and large, they have a lower concentration of economic power in top corporations than we do. So that seems to me to be very clear evidence of policy decisions that contribute to inequality in a substantive way. And then, of course, there's the whole area of tax policy. And then there's the corruption of the political system through money that then leads to entrenchment of industries and key players. So, while I'm willing to allow a certain amount of drift, let's say, I think that we tend to use as an excuse for the fact that many of our policies have dramatically exacerbated inequality.
I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Okay. Who wants to be the lucky last one? Yes, you're in the gray shirt here. Yeah, no, yellow and gray.
So I like your Nietzsche image a lot, but I'm wondering, philosophy, especially in the 20th century, has tended to be a very insulated discipline, and it's not always clear that it's having a social voice or a social effect, really. And as someone who's spent time in academic philosophy, I'm wondering what you think can change about the discipline of philosophy to enable it to have this sort of effect. What are the steps for that?
Sorry, it's not a plan.
I know, really. Bob's sympathetic because he's a math professor, so I can go ahead and. The reason why I left philosophy in part was that I felt that it was closing itself off into a narrow realm of inquiry that was not going to have a significant impact. And in the book that Bob mentioned, I wrote 25 years ago or something, I was arguing for a new approach to philosophy, but the philosophy world ignored it. They completely ignored it. And it seemed clear to me then that it was driving itself towards irrelevance, and to my surprise, it has gotten arguably more irrelevant since that time. Look, and if I ask myself, well, why is that happening? I think it's, the institutional factors really are kind of overwhelming, because the modern university, especially in its American form, really puts a lot of emphasis on disciplinary structure. That's the silos in which people move up, and I think that will, in the case of philosophy, where it's very hard to know what the objective domain is. I mean, if you're doing molecular biology, it's pretty clear that you're looking at molecules associated with life, right? Where in philosophy, it's just a lot harder to find that. So I think that lends itself to a tremendous amount of insecurity and policing of boundaries and so on. So I just want to fall back on the recommendations I was making back then, which is just keep in mind that philosophy is something that you have to carry around with you. It's something that should be informing your perspective on everything you do. I think it informs, my approach to inequality. And philosophy departments perhaps shouldn't be looking at themselves as ways of building up a systematic body of knowledge so much as providers of a certain set of very interesting, fascinating tools that people can then carry around with them. But then, I think my chances of getting tenure at a philosophy department are pretty low right now. So anyway, I guess that was it. I don't want to keep you guys too much longer.
Yes, let's thank Dr. Stewart again.